To know yourself and to become what you are two central elements of the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. This was meant to be an antidote to the death of God and the resulting crisis in meaning that would inevitably follow. Nietzsche's proposed way of overcoming this nihilism was for individuals to create their own values. Throughout Nietzsche's works, he calls upon individuals to resist the values of the herd, which breed conformity, and to instead create their own values. What isn't well known is what Nietzsche meant by know yourself and become what you are, or how you create your own values. So in this video, I'll explain how you can start your own journey of self-cultivation and to create your own values in the way Nietzsche envisioned. In the German language, Bildung refers to a tradition of self-cultivation, where education and philosophy are united for the process of individual and cultural transformation. The American essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson and the German poet Goethe were important influences for Nietzsche's concept of Bildung. In both Goethe's and Emerson's philosophy, the notion of Bildung is absolutely central. Goethe described the process of character formation as self-cultivation. Emerson defines it as nature in its highest form, or nature perfected. In other words, character is the result of voluntary work done on one's own nature with the aim of perfecting and enhancing it. Although the seeds of our moral and spiritual dispositions are already present in us, and the fundamental character is, so to say, inborn in each of us, nonetheless the form, both moral and spiritual, that we acquire as adults is the effect of external circumstances that touch us in different ways, sometimes more deeply, sometimes more superficially. For both Nietzsche and Emerson, knowing oneself and becoming who one is go hand in hand. The act of knowing yourself begins with the process of undoing the self-knowledge that you assume you already have. Becoming is the ongoing process of losing yourself and then finding yourself again. Before we get any further, I want to address some misunderstandings and confusion of Nietzsche's project of self-cultivation. The intellectual Jordan Peterson has said that Nietzsche was wrong because individuals cannot create their own values. This is simply a misunderstanding of Nietzsche's position on character development. The idea of changing your character as you please presupposes a free will as cause, which Nietzsche absolutely rejects. Freedom of will, according to Nietzsche, is nothing more than freedom of thought. What makes Nietzsche's position more confusing is that he also rejects Schopenhauer's immutability of character. Instead, Nietzsche charts a middle course between a no restrictions character development and a total immutability of character. That the character is unalterable is not in the strict sense true. This favorite proposition means rather no more than that, during the brief lifetime of a man, the effective motives are unable to scratch deeply enough to erase the imprinted script of many millennia. If one imagines a man of 80,000 years, however, one would have in him a character totally alterable, so that an abundance of different individuals would evolve out of him one after the other. Nietzsche sets no limits to the changeability of character. If we could live for 80,000 years, we could presumably change everything about ourselves. However, for practical purposes, character development is limited by temporality. Since we are limited by the length of our lives, we cannot change everything about ourselves. So we must work with the set of traits we are born with. Nietzsche says the past flows within us in 100 different waves. What this means is that we are the result of centuries of moral and spiritual development. Emerson says that our ancestors' qualities constitute the variety of notes for that new piece of music that our life is. This idea is very important for character development in the Nietzschean sense, and we will return to it later. Both Emerson and Nietzsche assert that human beings are not ultimately free. We cannot choose the internal and external conditions we live in. However, we are free to not oppose these circumstances and be defeated, or to interpret them to our own advantage. Just like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche conceived character as a relation of drives. However, differently from Schopenhauer, Nietzsche does not think of drives as fixed properties. Drives are intended as interpretive processes acquired through our interaction with the external world. These drives are the interpretive processes that project meaning into the world and ultimately give shape to our lives. Whether or not we choose to explore our character is an expression of a drive. According to Goethe, the natural realm is ruled by two competing forces. On the one hand, an inner necessity drives each organism to grow until all potentialities of its nature are fulfilled. And on the other hand, external circumstances offer resistance to this process and constrain growth. Both Nietzsche and Goethe conclude that infinite growth is a law of nature, and this applies to individuals as well. Emerson calls the individual a piece of fate in his essay, The Conduct of Life. For fate is so prevailing, man is also a part of it, and can confront fate with fate. Nietzsche accounts for the process of becoming who one is as a self-selection of drives, aimed at specifying who one is. While social selection selects drives with a view to the prosperity of a group, self-selection favors the drives that are aimed at expressing one's own individuality. Nietzsche refers to ideals as the hopes of our drives. Ideals of this sort are anticipatory hopes of our drives, and nothing else. As surely as we have drives, they lay out in our fantasy a sort of schema of ourselves, a schema of how we should be in order to satisfy our drives. This is idealizing. Any discussion of Nietzsche's concept of self-cultivation must take account of the concept of will to power. Although Nietzsche never systematically explored the concept of will to power, it can be summarized as self-determination, or the act of bringing one's will to bear on oneself and surroundings. According to Nietzsche, Spinoza's principle of self-preservation would bring a halt to all change. Instead, he says the opposite is true. Every living thing does not seek to preserve itself, but rather to enhance its power and to become something more. Even the body within which individuals treat each other as equals will have to be an incarnate will to power. It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living, because life simply is will to power. People do not change themselves by conscious deliberation, because there is no metaphysical will that can direct the project of giving style to your character. As some mistakenly suggest, Nietzsche does not believe that you can consciously create an ideal and then act in accordance with it. Rather, this aspirational self is achieved by an unconscious and involuntary output of our drives. Even though Nietzsche regards free will as an illusion, he still thinks we should continue to use the concept for practical purposes. It may be useful to think that you have the choice whether or not to drink a glass of water, for example, even though it is our dominant drive at any moment that determines our actions. Decision-making is fundamentally a competition between different drives. These drives are goal-oriented, and it is precisely based on the result they are aimed at that they are selected, but in a subconscious way. This is why the process of character development appears as unintentional. Some people will feel no need for character development, while others make it their life's task to give style to their character. Nietzsche says this is nothing more than destiny. You could not act otherwise. The internal organization of drives in one person will make them conform to the standards of the herd, while others seek to become individuals and resent the influence of the group. It is this reason that Nietzsche says we are not accountable for engaging or not engaging in the process of self-perfection. Self-perfection comes about as an unintentional outcome of one's own internal organization of drives. There are two factors that determine who we are and what we will become, according to Nietzsche and Emerson. These two principles are force and environment. What Nietzsche refers to as strength of will is how much force one can bring to bear in this process. Life is a search after power, i.e., every living being, from plant to man, tends to put into action its own potential. This expansive process is, however, limited by circumstances. The form of each being will thus result from the interplay between its internal force and environmental pressure. Circumstances are not only external conditions, but also internal constraints. Innate and acquired dispositions are even more powerful and disruptive in the course of our life than natural disasters like earthquakes or floods. This is because they affect our thinking unconsciously, which makes them difficult to recognize and oppose. To begin the process of self-perfection, you will need a sketch of the final outcome. This will be provided to us by our drives and then translated into a conscious purpose. Firstly, Nietzsche thinks we should start by analyzing the influences we have been subjected to since childhood. Family, education, society, and morality have imposed beliefs and values that we have assimilated and now feel as instincts. The first step to become who one is to recognize these acquired instincts and remove them. Nietzsche was impressed by Emerson's heroic model of character development as a liberation of our true self from the pressures imposed by the herd. This individual does not fear to challenge the authority of the institutions in the society he is born in, and heroically bears isolation and misunderstanding in order to express his own originality. This was Nietzsche's free spirit. This person removes external influences and denies the dominant views of the time, as well as the expectations of society. Against the effects of conformism, Nietzsche and Emerson urge everyone to be yourself. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would rather gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it is goodness. Once you have freed yourself from the pressures to conform to the values of the group, you can start exploring your own conditions of existence. These conditions are the values and beliefs you will need to grow and develop into a unique human being. To do this, you will need to break with your previous habits and test the effects of different conditions on yourself. For example, you can experiment with your diet, the climate, or what you read, as well as many other things. In this process, knowledge has value as a means. We need to explore the habits of our thoughts and emotions, as well as explore new intellectual requirements and nourishment. We can use the knowledge of the ancients to learn about our history and to experiment with ourselves. Greek literature and philosophy is a rich source of information here. For the Greeks, philosophy was a way of life, and wasn't so bogged down in abstraction and technical discussions like most of modern philosophy. The Greeks were trying to create a system of personal ethics. The more conditions you experiment with, the deeper you will unfold and realize yourself. Nietzsche was frequently moving around to experiment with new climates and often changed his reading habits as well. Just before his mental collapse, he wrote in a letter to a friend that he was ready to free himself from all his beliefs and to start the process all over again. To both Nietzsche and Emerson, personal vocation plays a key role in the process of self-cultivation. Each individual has a unique talent to express. In some moments, we may find activities that we perform better than others. These are the moments in which the true self manifests itself. We should revere these insights for the truth they reveal about ourselves. One of the central elements of Nietzsche's idea of self-cultivation involves how we interpret pain and misfortune. The readiness to change and the capacity to profit from every circumstance is called by Emerson intellectual nomadism. Emerson's intellectual nomadism corresponds to Nietzsche's skepticism of strength, or what he calls active nihilism. This active nihilism characterizes all great spirits who can neither be satisfied with any truth for long or renounce exploring themselves further. Nietzsche recognized this as a typical attitude of the wanderer, who takes pleasure in change and transience. Insofar as the man devoted to knowledge has abandoned the belief in eternal truths, he is similar to a wanderer, i.e., a traveler who is conscious that his voyage has no final destination. This fact does not deprive the journey of its value, nor the wanderer of his enthusiasm. Each stage of the never-ending voyage of knowledge, i.e., each experience, is recognized as worth living for. The shadow is the negative aspect of this loss of firm truth and meaning. This is what Nietzsche elsewhere refers to as passive nihilism. The skepticism of weakness embodied by the shadow is a counterpart of the wanderer. The shadow says, all is meaningless, nothing is worth it, so there's no point in searching. This pessimism or skepticism of weakness prevents many people from profiting from experience. Nietzsche and Emerson made a correlation between people's character and their good or bad fortune. Some people continuously complain about misfortune, while others seem to be happy every day and under all circumstances. The ones who seem happy and are not brought down by misfortune are what Nietzsche calls the well-constituted types, or as having a cheerful disposition. Bad experiences don't make those with this cheerful disposition resentful. Nietzsche wanted us to see that events aren't good or bad in themselves, but people make them so through the interpretation that their character suggests. It was in this sense that Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, you will direct your life and you will call it fate." The soul is not touched by experiences it cannot assimilate. We select the experiences that are easiest to digest and assimilate. Since the individual is a multiplicity of drives, he will interpret information from outside according to the internal configuration of these said drives. This means that all events are linked to the person they happen to, because they are produced by him through his interpretations. As Emerson states, a man's fortunes are the fruits of his character. So if it is true that our good or bad luck is determined by our character, it is also true that it is up to us to work on our character, and to become a person that interprets everything to our advantage or to succumb to the pressure of adverse fate. In general, every evil to which we do not succumb is a benefactor. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Instead of being only shaped and bound by circumstance, you can become a force of nature when you understand its laws. This individual understands the necessity of nature's laws, and how to profit from them, and thus he himself expresses the same huge power as nature. In other words, you confront fate with fate. Both Nietzsche and Emerson conceptualized an imperialist ego, which aims to expand its power beyond the boundaries imposed by the limited time span of its existence. The stronger this will to power, the wider the horizon the individual can embrace. Nietzsche did not think of the problem of character development as finding your true self. There is not a true self that the individual should discover and fulfill. From the same person, a multiplicity of selves could potentially develop. The present man contains in himself, under the form of instincts, all the past judgments and deeds of his ancestors. history can be relived in our own souls. Nietzsche's conception of history is not objective or scientific here. Instead, he's referring to a subjective, emotional sharing of experiences. This means that, according to the mood and the moment, we can sympathize with different events in history, which tells us what we are and reveals us to ourselves. In other words, according to our present interest, we can instinctively select some facts from the flow of history, which our souls resound with particular intensity. Then we relive these moments internally, drawing from them the same sensations that we would have had through a first-hand experience. In his book, Human All Too Human, Nietzsche explains that we need to experience history in this way, because direct self-observation is not sufficient to know ourselves. He says the past continues to flow within us in 100 waves, and we are what we experience of this continued flowing. Nietzsche's ideal man of knowledge shares in the collective experience of humanity to expand his own individual experience beyond the narrow confines of his individual life. According to Nietzsche, we can relive the history of our ancestors within our own souls. If we allow history to flow through us, we can experience the process of becoming and transformation in Egypt and Greece, Byzantium and Rome, France and Germany. As Nietzsche says in Human All Too Human, thus self-knowledge will become universal knowledge with regard to all that is past. This is what Nietzsche was referring to when he said, to become a 100-eyed Argus. Do you want to become an impartial universal eye? Then you shall have to do it as an individual that has gone through many individuals and whose latest individual requires all previous ones as functions. This is the case of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, who as a creator and interpreter of events, has earned the right to sit at the gaming table of the gods. He wants to exploit the power of lightning, to drink from all glasses, and to wash himself even with dirty water. Both Nietzsche and Emerson often criticize modern society for providing the individual with too much comfort, and most of the time, with ready-made choices. He has thus deprived both of the responsibility of truly knowing himself and of becoming what he is. For the individual for whom knowledge is the highest aim, every circumstance, even the worst ones, are welcomed as an opportunity to experience life and further himself. With this attitude, all misfortune and pain become necessary and valuable for the capacity they give you to overcome yourself. Thus, while most people's pleasure is always tinged with pain and ruined by the awareness that no pleasure lasts forever, the interpreter of events' pains are instead edged with pleasure, because he can recognize their utility from the point of view of self-knowledge and character development. In summary, Nietzsche and Emerson insist on the idea of promoting individuality and strengthening the ego against the conformity and selfless morality of modern society. As individuals, we need to expand our experience through history and intellectual nomadism to explore our own potential. Since this potential is in principle unlimited, there's no limit to the experiences the individual striving after power would like to make. The acceptance of life as it is, and welcoming all events as an opportunity for character building, will lead to an attitude of experimentation for taking pleasure in change. And lastly, it leads to a revaluation of history as an invaluable repository of experiences from which the present individual can and should profit.